Welcome to the Podcast Growth Show. Next level thinking on how to increase your podcast subscriber base. Hi everyone, Jürgen from the Podcast Growth Show, and in wrapping season one of our Podcast Growth Show, I thought it would be a good idea to reflect on the topics that we've already covered this season. And so what I'd like to do in this episode is to sort of do that in a form of a podcast marketing checklist. In other words, these are the podcast growth and marketing strategies that we've covered this season, and I would like to provide a view back and summary of these. So I'm sort of thinking of this as two segments. Maybe let's talk about the basics first, because in our comprehensive podcast marketing guide, which by the way you can download in our show notes, I provided links to all of the podcast directories where new podcasters should submit their show, and we dedicated an entire episode to that topic. So that was called Podcast Directories, the best ones to boost your podcast. And so for beginning podcasters, that's ensuring that your podcast is easy to discover on all of the existing podcast directories is one of the most important initial marketing steps to take for your new podcast. And even veteran podcasters should review new arrivals on the podcast directory scene about once a year. And what we did in that episode was we ranked each directory based on their popularity and based on how many visits that directory gets. So there's some blindingly obvious one, but some of them, that were pretty interesting. So there's an increasing list of podcast directories where you can submit a show for consideration. And so in order to sort of structure the discussion around, well, which ones are the popular ones, which ones are the important ones, we used a free web service called SimilarWeb to see how popular each directory really is. So we've included a lot of stats in addition to the links to these directories and instructions on how to submit. So you can take the point of view that submitting to any and all of them doesn't take that much work, and so these stats kind of don't matter, but I still found it interesting to see how popular some of the smaller directories are in terms of how much traffic they generate. Anyhow, for new podcasters, directory submissions are the first step in any podcast marketing checklist, and this was the topic of our first episode. So you can find the list of directories and these stats at podcastgrowthshow.com/E1 for episode 1. So the second topic that we tackled was how to get your podcast guests to help promote your podcast. Many of us have interview shows, and that's one of the more effective ways of promoting your episodes that we know of. But getting your podcast guests to actually help with this is more tricky than you might think. And so episode 4 was all about that. It was about how to make it easy for you both. Because many podcasters have this unspoken assumption that their podcast guest will jump in there and help promote their podcast episode. And it's important not to fall into that expectation trap. Because if that's an unspoken assumption, it's often, not true. After having launched over a dozen shows, I found that getting your podcast guests to actually share episode links with their own social networks can be a bit like pulling teeth. Like asking for reviews, people seem happy to offer this and say, no problem, I'll do it. But then it rarely happens without gentle reminders, repeat reminders. And depending on your personality type, asking explicitly and sending multiple follow-ups kind of, might not be in our nature. I know it's not in mine. So especially if your guests don't follow through, I hate sending those kinds of follow-up and reminder emails. But in episode 4, which you can find at podcastgrowthshow.com/E4, offers some tips on making this easier for yourself and your guests. In our podcast marketing checklist, the tips and tools sort of fall into two primary categories around this. One is designing a pleasurable experience for being on your show in the first place. And 2 is making it super easy to help your guests promote your podcast. And we have some really cool tools that help you send pre-structured tweets and pre-structured shares, so that becomes basically a one-click exercise for your guests afterwards, and some ways and scripts on how to follow up. Moving on to some more advanced topics in our podcast marketing checklist. It's podcast guesting. That's an often overlooked cure for stalled subscriber growth, because In episode 2, we reveal why podcast guesting is one of the best possible marketing strategies for podcasters. So that's where you are invited to appear on someone else's podcast, and you basically get to talk about your show and what you're passionate about there. And we have a whole tutorial video where we have a step-by-step process on how to automate a personalized podcast guesting outreach campaign, because a lot of this is getting in contact with and making someone aware, and then getting yourself invited on one of these shows. So being on guest on other people's podcasts is always good PR. And by the way, that's true not just for podcasters. This is true for anyone. And the primary benefits come from the fact, for podcasters, the primary benefits come from the fact that being a guest on someone else's podcast instantly overcomes one of the more difficult and expensive marketing challenges, which is to reach podcast listeners in the first place. Because if you appear on somebody else's podcast, then you're automatically reaching a podcast audience. If you have a Facebook ad, or if you're spending money on other paid forms of advertising, that's not assured at all. It's much harder to target podcast audiences this way. Also, it's great for SEO. Guest appearances on podcasts usually result in a backlink to your website, to your podcast show pages. And that's a big deal because incoming links and backlinks are one of the more important ranking signals that Google uses. So if you're podcasting as part of a content strategy, you want your show notes to appear in the search results. You got to have some links incoming to your site. And each time you appear on someone else's show, that's a very likely outcome. Also, this is evergreen. You might get an initial boost from traffic, but the episode you appear on will continue to exist, and people will listen to those episodes in years from now, meaning the episodes that you appeared on from someone else. So this back catalog listen is kind of an evergreen content strategy, which is a great tactic as well. But so really, above all, it's attracting the ideal audiences, people listening to podcasts already. And the idea is that you get to promote, and people will get to check out your own show. We've seen this countless times. A great appearance on a popular show can really skyrocket your own podcast subscriber base overnight, especially if your website is designed for conversion. So it's not just all about getting people to subscribe on iTunes. It's also trying to get some traffic to your website and getting people on your email list. So the secret to making this most effective is that if you can take your own message, mission, and values and match them with that of your podcast, and of your host podcast, and of your podcast host that invited you, you're attracting a super engaged audience. We talked a little bit in this episode about what it takes to implement this. And it comes down, like so many things, to either time or money. Time and expertise or money, I should say, because these sorts of outreach campaigns are time consuming to set up. Unless you know how to automate them, or unless you're ready to hire someone else to help do the heavy lifting for you. And it's so often the case, you have to spend either the time or the money to do that. And as a result, there are several paid programs out there that are really good at this. And there's also some paid programs that teach why this marketing approach is so effective. Steve Olsher's program, I think, Podcasting for Profit, comes to mind. But that's what we did in episode 2, is we talked about these sorts of programs and options for you to actually go and do this. So if you're a do-it-yourself type on a budget, and you have the time and willing to learn some the expertise around it, episode 2 offers an entire email outreach campaign with templates, swipe files, video tutorials, and free automation tools that you can use to set up your very own podcast guesting campaign. So go and download that if you like. If you're short on time and patience, but you're willing to spend a little bit of money to have someone else do it for you, episode 2 lists several of the best programs and services that you can hire to help you do this. So you can find our entire downloadable outreach system, complete with these guesting templates and resources at podcastgrowthshow.com/E2. That's what episode 2 was about. And so, speaking about pay to play, another episode that we did this season covered paid podcast advertising and sort of a look behind the scenes about what's effective and what's not. And do they really work for podcasters trying to promote their show? And which platforms are the most effective and affordable? So in episode 3, we took a look at the 3 platforms: Google AdWords, Facebook, and using some podcast ad networks. So using paid ads for promoting a podcast may not be for everyone. A lot of casual podcasters are in it just for the fun. And if your show grows organically, fine, but spending money on ads is not something that, everyone would consider. However, when podcasting is part of a business content strategy, which I've increasingly seen and which many of our clients, our podcast clients actually are businesses that are somehow using their podcast to try to attract attention and build their brands and build their visibilities. Well, still, when those folks engage in trying to use paid advertising platforms, there's some common objections and questions that arise. First of all, isn't it too expensive to try to get new subscribers? How do you measure whether these ads are even effective? How can you be sure that your ads are even reaching podcast listeners? So those are some common questions that we try to address in that episode. And overall, I find that podcasting for business is more inbound than outbound. In other words, successful business podcasts should offer solutions and should give away some valuable content, solve prospects' problems, or provide training and education. And so they're extremely effective in that regard in building a brand's authority. But podcasts are not effective at directly selling stuff to cold traffic. So if you're a business getting into podcasting as a way to sell something, just stop. On the other hand, if you're a business and that already has a good understanding of inbound content marketing and maybe even has a funnel set up, podcasts can serve as a great entry vehicle into that funnel. As a business podcaster, you get to talk about your ideal, to your ideal and relevant audience when they're in a receptive mode. Just think about what people are doing when they're listening to their favorite podcast, the one that you're now appearing on, and you're in their ear talking about that. They're likely commuting, they're working out, they're going for a walk, and this listening modality is very different from interrupting an audience with a paid ad in the middle of browsing through Facebook after work, for example. So the getting to know, like, and trust factor is huge in podcasting, and that's why podcast listeners are, in most marketing stats, considered to be a very lucrative audience, because as you get to offer solutions, entertainment, education, you present your core ideas to them. But as I said, it sort of takes a vision, and a longer term buy-in into an inbound strategy. And so with paid ads, my personal experience has been that for podcasts, it's usually more appropriate for businesses that have a solid web presence, a social media presence, and some pay-per-click ads maybe in the past. It's usually, I find that it's only one piece of the puzzle to serve to attract an ideal audience into a marketing funnel. For a brand new podcast to try to look at paid ads as the primary way to get subscribers, is a little more challenging. And we talk about that a little bit in that episode. And so what we compared really is Facebook ads versus Google AdWords versus podcast ad networks. And so if you're a solo podcaster focused on getting more listeners, it's an expensive way to do it. I mean, no doubt, you do have to spend some money. But that said, Facebook is generally more affordable and more flexible than Google Ads. I think Google Ads wind up just being more on a cost per click basis. And so no matter what you do downstream or how good your landing pages or your offer or what it is that you're offering is, I think on a like-for-like comparison basis, Google AdWords will tend to be more expensive than Facebook. But at the same time, Facebook makes it a little easier to actually target podcast listeners. And one of the resources we share in episode 3 is we have a 5-step process for targeting podcast listeners on Facebook, and we give that away in case any podcast listeners are experimenting with Facebook ads. So there's a downloadable 5-step process that you can download as a PDF guide. Also in episode 3, we explore another option, which is to create and launch your own audio ad and place it on someone else's podcast with, one of the podcast ad networks like Midroll or Advertise Cast and others. So we review what options are available. And, what I like about that approach, it's not free either. It's expensive as well, but it's very effective. It's more effective than either Facebook or Google AdWords, simply for the fact that it solves the one thing that Facebook and Google Ads cannot easily address, which is presenting your podcast, presenting your ad to podcast listeners only. So visit the podcastgrowthshow.com/E3 to learn more about all this and to download our 5-step Facebook targeting process. And talking about Facebook, some people consider running social contests as another form of paid ads because that's usually done via Facebook. And that's actually also a very good and effective way. So let's talk about that next. That was an episode that we dedicated to that called Podcast Marketing with Social Contests. And it's still a great promotion idea. Episode 6 covered how newly launched as well as older podcasts can attract fans and subscribers using contests like this. And a few years ago, this was all the rage. Podcast contests sort of, they used to be associated with podcast launches because that was an effective technique to boost a new show into the new and noteworthy section of iTunes. And mostly the focus back then was to gather reviews on iTunes in exchange for being entered on a social contest. So episode 6 covered this. And what we talked about is, reasons why this is not as popular a launch strategy anymore. I think that the algorithms changed and the visibility challenges changed. So that alone, or that primarily, it just doesn't drive, you can't reliably get into the top of the iTunes new and noteworthy with this anymore. But we also talk about why this podcast marketing strategy is still a very good idea today. There are some other reasons for doing that. And we talked about prize selection tips and how they're kind of key to this. I mean, what do you not want to give away and what do you want to give away? The relevance and the fit for your audience is super important in terms of choosing the types of giveaways that you might offer. We also talk about the best free and paid contest platforms out there. Again, I'm sort of always looking at it from what if you're a do-it-yourself person, you want it for free, or what if you are able to afford one of the paid platforms. So we talk about why iTunes reviews still matter today, and also why getting reviews and testimonials is kind of as hard as it ever was. But when it comes down to it, even your friends and relatives sometimes have a hard time getting around to leaving you those iTunes reviews or reviews on other platforms. And I would propose that reviews are still important and shouldn't be ignored, even if they don't automatically, it was never automatic, but even if they don't help you get into top 10 or top 100 of iTunes, they still lend credibility and social proof to a podcast. Seeing when somebody visits your podcast page on iTunes and they see that dozens of people are leaving great reviews, that might tip the scale for them to take action and subscribe. And also, on the other hand, seeing a podcast on iTunes with no reviews at all also kind of tells you something. So we looked at some of the free versus paid contest platform. And while I've not personally used every single one of them that we review, we still sort of had a look in comparing the solutions or what they're about. Because I'm always curious to decide for myself if a do-it-yourself approach is worth the effort, or if there's some good free solutions out there for those of us on a budget. And in this case, just to summarize, my own view and recommendation is pretty easy to come by. If you decide to run any kind of podcast marketing contest, use one of the the paid contest platforms. They're definitely worth it, and it saves you a ton of time, and they're more effective. And so it's just very complicated to try to like automate this and by piecing together a bunch of tools when there's such great solutions out there. So check out our podcast contest platform reviews, tips on setting up and running your own podcast social contest, and you can find all of this on episode 6 at podcastgrowthshow.com/E6. And also, with a focus on email subscribers, that's another thing I like about this strategy. Apart from getting iTunes reviews, podcast marketing contests with the right prizes and incentives, can quickly add this visibility and, more importantly, add people to your email list, because then you have a way to reach out to them in the future and engage them. So in summary, while it might not reliably get you into a new and noteworthy section anymore, still having these great reviews lends credibility, and email subscribers to your podcast that you pick up along the way are a permanent asset for your business. So talking about email subscribers, good segue to episode 5, which was about the design and the importance of your podcast homepage. What we talked about in episode 5 is podcast homepage design patterns for conversion and list building. So as a former UX design lead for a company, I'm a bit of a conversion optimization geek. And so forgive me for getting excited about this topic. But this episode features a complete walkthrough video that explores why podcast website design should focus on email list building, what some of the importance of that for us is, instead of just being overly focused on just iTunes subscribers. And, we do a walkthrough and a design pattern. We offer a design pattern called the Upside Down Podcast Homepage. And what we're talking about is a highly converting design pattern that's designed to basically increase your email list and, get people to subscribe to your podcast, primarily on email. It offers, of course, all the links to your episodes and ways to subscribe on all the other platforms. But, our focus tends to be on email list building as a business asset. So apologies in advance. Episode 5 is a pretty visual one for that, because we're talking about a design pattern and we go through it. And so the video is important. Jump over to podcastgrowthshow.com/E5 and, watch the walkthrough video. And there are basically 2 versions, a more simple one and a complete version for established podcasts, where you might have multiple seasons or you tackle multiple topics and you've got, a pretty well-established podcast already. And we have another version just for a very simple new podcast with a niche audience. So you can grab the downloadable version of this design pattern with annotations and, and explanations, from our podcast resourcing guide, and you can find that also on that episode. So, a lot of people ask me about, well, why this focus on email list building instead of instead of just focusing on iTunes and the listening. And for me, it's definitely a both and, but I get asked this question by sort of the podcasting purist or old school podcasters who experience and might already have a solid following. And for them, understandably, the goal is to serve listeners on iTunes. And I'm still all about that. But what I found is that a lot of people that have started podcasts like in 2018, 2019, and they're new to the scene, building an audience or building an audio audience is very challenging. And often their goals and their business goals are also in line with, or they have a website, or they have a business, they have launched a book, they are an expert at something. And so, there's a lot of additional reasons for having an email list be an important business asset for them. So this holy grail of getting new iTunes subscribers and getting into the new noteworthy charts, focusing all about like getting people to click on that iTunes subscribe button. From my point of view, it's not it's not my area or our area of focus. And that's in part because the podcast algorithm and the ranking on iTunes, as well as the new noteworthy top 100 charts, have been seriously gamed in 2018 and beyond. And they're full of entries that kind of don't belong there. I know that there are people paying thousands of dollars to sort of hijack this and hire overseas click farms for instant presence in the top chart. So I just think that a focus on quality, a focus on just providing the best possible content and creating a good experience for your listeners and creating a good experience for your website visitors is where it's at. I think that discoverability via Google, I get, I think, far more podcast subscribers through Google discoverability and SEO than through anything else. We get, our clients are getting 65% of their traffic from Google searches. And that's why people discover their podcasts. So from my perspective, we want to serve that audience as well. And what it comes down to, is I'd gladly trade 1,000 iTunes subscribers who are anonymous, who I don't know, who I can never really communicate with. I don't know who these people are. And apart from the fact that they once clicked on my subscribe button, I don't know what happens after, or I know very little about that through, the state of analytics as they are today. I would gladly trade 1,000 of those iTunes subscribers for just 100, entries on my email list. List building. It sounds like a trite concept, but still, for me, it's one of the most valuable assets that a business can build today. And I think that applies for podcasters as well, because you can provide your audience with a more valuable context. You can understand better of what they are interested in. I have insights into which pages on my website are the more popular. I have a sense as to, what topics people are interested in. I can produce more of that content. And all of that relies on good analytics. And most of that comes from my website, not from iTunes or podcast analytics at this point. I think there's some gains being made in the analytics space. I know NPR launched this new analytics standard. There's some discussion around, the privacy concerns around all of that. But this stuff already exists in a very sophisticated way if you have marketing automation platforms built into your website, the way that we recommend. So anyway, these podcast homepage design patterns for conversion then, is intended to better serve your audience. What I mean is, this concept of like, hey, conversion optimization sounds a little crass for some people, but really it's not. The way I look at it as a UX designer, it's meant to create a better experience. It's meant to serve our audience better. It's based on empathy with our audience. What is it that they're looking for? What can you help them with? How can you help them self-direct their journey through your website? How can you expose and help them find your best and most relevant content, the one that they're interested in? If you've got 300 episodes, well, what are you doing to help the people that are worried about one thing or interested in something very specific? What are you doing to help them discover that? And that's what this design pattern is all about. So for me, conversion optimization is not a dirty word. For me, email list building is not a dirty word. I'm just doing it to better serve my audience. That's how I look at it. Anyway, visit podcastgrowthshow.com/E5 for the walkthrough video, and then also to get that downloadable design pattern as an additional resource. All right, so in another episode, we talked about Facebook ads. I know we mentioned them as far as the, running contests. And it's sort of like a little pet peeve, because you might think that running Facebook ads would be an excellent vehicle to promote a podcast. And that's true in some respects. And that's because Facebook just has this laser targeting of an audience. And so you can find on the topic that you are tackling in your podcast, usually Facebook has some excellent tools to help you reach that particular audience and set up some ads for that. But episode 7, we talked a little bit about a pet peeve of mine, which is the episode was called 5 Reasons Not to Promote Your Podcast on Facebook. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek. It's not that I'm arguing that Facebook is a poor platform to promote a podcast, quite the opposite. But it's that the method that most people recommend on how to do this is a bit flawed. Make a long story short, a lot of experts propose an approach that I fundamentally disagree with. Many marketers recommend promoting a Facebook episode by directly linking it to your iTunes episode, to your iTunes Andrew or Spotify link. And in fact, that's, so I've seen a lot of Facebook ads and I've seen a lot of articles that recommend that when you set up a Facebook ad for a particular episode, that it links directly to there. And, the argument is that it's easier for your audience. They can directly start listening to it. It's some people don't have good show notes, or argue that you don't need show notes pages at all. And so they just link when they run a social promotion, when they boost a post or when they share a post, it just links to iTunes. And and I'm always like, really? iTunes needs your traffic? No, your website and your business asset needs your traffic in order to earn more Google juice, in order to increase its rank. So this advice that direct links to iTunes episode is the best way for Facebook ads to sort of capture people on mobile devices. I just think it's a little bit flawed for me. And so I fundamentally disagree with sending the traffic there, and I propose that people send the traffic to their own show notes pages. That's another reason why your show notes pages are important, is because if you do run any sort of promotions or ads, what you want to happen is you want that traffic to land on your website on that episode page. So that's what episode 7 focuses on, because you get to, in your show notes, provide additional links, resources, other things that people are discovering, helping them find out more about your guests. So in that episode, I'm not at all arguing to avoid Facebook. Quite the contrary. All I'm saying is that, your social and ad traffic to promote your podcast should land on your own great conversion optimized podcast episode or home pages. So that was the topic above, or how to set that up and how to structure these pages. Was the topic of the previous episode about the upside down homepage. Anyway, the effort or cost involved to create good show notes pages are really worthwhile in the long run, because the time that you spend doing that and spend on the show notes that one time, is actually small in comparison to the time that you spend preparing your episode, and getting ready for it, and creating your content in the first place. So it's just not that big of an increase. So I really am a big fan of creating really solid, really valuable show notes. So check out podcastgrowthshow.com/E7 for details. And so now that we've gotten my pet peeves out of the way, I guess it's pretty clear that I focus a lot on how your podcast show notes can be a central vehicle for promoting your show. And so episode 8 was all about how we get the most from those show notes. And that episode was called, is a how-to episode for easy podcast content distribution and content syndication. And I was really excited about this episode and about some of the tools that we discovered in 2018, that help us do this. Because when we publish to iTunes, we're already distributing our podcast, right? After all, between iTunes and our RSS feed, our podcast lands on all major important podcast listening platforms. Well, wait, not so fast. From my perspective, when podcasters market their shows, the RSS feed and these podcast directories are only part of the story. We're missing something in our podcast marketing checklist. And in episode 8, we discover what that is and a platform to help fill the gap. What we're talking about is content syndication. So here's a definition from Search Engine Watch. Content syndication is the process of pushing your blog post, article, video, or any piece of web-based content out to other third-party parties who will then republish it on their own sites. And this applies to podcasts as well, and specifically to show notes pages. We want to create brand awareness for our podcast by publishing our show notes and as stories on multiple websites, communities, social media, and email channels. And we're already doing this, aren't we, on when we publish on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, but we're only doing it for the audio portion. And so we're wanting to do the same thing with our show notes and basically cross-syndicate and push it out. So true multi-channel presence, is for me, content syndication is to our podcast show notes what podcast directories in iTunes is for our audio files. And it's a way to distribute our content more widely. And to establish a presence on all sorts of other platforms. So the benefits there are really great, because from not just traffic, not just discoverability, but also SEO, and greater amount of backlinks and more increased site authority. So when your episodes go live, you probably already share your show notes posts on Facebook, right? I mean, most people do that, or maybe on Twitter or on social platforms that you're active on. But have you thought about publishing your episode show notes as articles on Medium? I get a lot of traffic from this, or on Blogger, or to an ambassador network. So those are some of the ideas that we explore in episode 8. And we have a system for semi-automated distribution of show notes to as many platforms as possible. And we discuss that system. It's really cool. I love this. And the benefits of that, are far beyond traffic. So check out, the podcastgrowthshow.com/E8 for that. We're talking about the benefits of this content syndication strategy, how it works, how to automate it. This platform that we use for this called StoryChief. By the way, you get a free sign up there. Our podcast distribution and syndication process itself. And, we're looking at this platforms like the free, the basic, and the pro plans. It's very affordable, even if you go for one of the paid plans. But you can definitely play with the free ones for the syndication strategy. And, some of the results that we've actually seen by using this podcast ambassador network and by using this multi-channel syndication process for our show notes. All right, so getting closer to the end, the episode, as the last episode of the season, before this one, was around our entire podcast workflow and content strategy. As we're wrapping up season 1 of the Podcast Growth Show, I sort of thought it was time to zoom out for the big picture in episode 9, and at the same time zoom in a little bit onto how we specifically, what the workflow is that we follow for our own show. It's not meant to be a guide or even a recommendation, as part of a checklist or even a checklist for this sort. Episode 9 was more to just talk about our particular approach, and you can take from it as much or as little as you want, because there are some challenges that we have and experienced in this season just by virtue of the fact that we did video as well as audio. And for those of us who follow us, you realize that we're approaching this as a content strategy. So this workflow includes SEO research, keyword research. We're going, kind of pretty deep in, some of the preparatory work that even goes into structuring and coming up with the season. So this might not be for everyone. But it is the result of an overall content strategy. And so that episode I structured into a strategy segment for new and existing podcasts, sort of starting with the end in mind, having real clarity around your goals, clarity around your audience, confidence that your value proposition serves your listeners, and, and just having the reasoning for your show and maybe even the season be crystal clear. And then the other segment in that episode was around the planning process itself. Most people just want to get started and hit the record button. I myself included, I get impatient with the planning process. But unless you already have a dozen or so episodes under your belt, you'll discover that just no matter what you do, there should be, or there usually is, some amount of planning involved. And if content strategy is something remotely on your horizon, I talk to a lot of podcasters that kind of get lost in this planning stage. They get paralyzed from all the planning, and that's where the desire to just hit the record button and do something comes from. Well, so we want to offer a kind of a structured way of thinking about this. It's kind of detailed, and like I said, you can simplify and just take from that episode what you want. But it's only one possible way, and I'm not suggesting in any way that you adopt our methods. Because they can sound kind of scary. But we can, on our end, we tolerate a little bit of complexity because we've seen that it produces results. And complexity also doesn't mean that things can't be automated or outsourced or simplified. Both complexity and simplicity can really coexist from where I'm sitting. And we also had a segment, in that. So we basically talked about strategy, we talked about planning, execution, and promotion. Now, on the promotion side, we kept that episode pretty short, simply because the whole season has been about this. But I'd invite you to go to podcastgrowthshow.com/E9 for our entire workflow with some infographics, with free access to the SEO research tools we use, and with a free sign up for our content syndication platform that we use. So check it out if you're interested in in how we approached our season, and see whether you can find some things that might be useful for your own show and for your own podcast. And also, if you're producing video, I'd love to hear from you to see some of the challenges that you've gotten into when you're doing both in a season. So anyway, I hope that you don't think that all of this is overkill. In my mind, the lion's share of this work goes into the planning and into the initial planning and into setting up the templates and the processes that then just get executed, rotely. And so it's a lot of setup work, and it becomes much easier as you progress. So that's it. We're wrapping up season 1. I want to express gratitude to you and thank you as our listeners and readers and video watchers, and all the people that have followed us, as well as all the people that have taught us. Everything that I know comes from folks that the School of Podcasting, Dave Jackson, Daniel Lewis, Ray Ortega, and a number of other people, that helped me get started, and where I oriented myself. And if I can just contribute, a small piece to the puzzle for, people starting out today, or, people wanting to get to the next level with their podcast growth and marketing, I'm very pleased if I can help any, just a few people even do that. Anyway, I'm looking forward in season 2, which will launch in the spring of 2019. I'm looking forward to sharing some great conversations and insights with other podcasters out there on what's working for them and how they're approaching promoting their own shows. In the meantime, here's signing off, Jürgen from Polymash. Here's to better podcasting and podcast promotion. See you on the other side. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Growth Show. Visit us at podcastgrowthshow.com and download your podcasting resources guide.